start off by telling us how the book came about and how you came to be the person who got to put Orwell into Scots for the first time?
Aye, well, I will. But Gavin's kind of stole my thunder there, because the most venal reason was just that Orwell had run out of copyright, so suddenly everybody can do whatever they like with Animal Farm in 1984 and all these works of these great works of literature. Suddenly these things are up for, we can dog-wire them like they're somebody else's Picasso. So that was one reason. It wasn't the only reason though. The main reason really was just that, we'll get into the politics of things later, I'm sure, maybe, but the social political moment that we're in right now, obviously, suddenly Orwell's never went away, but over the last few years, Orwell suddenly became more popular than ever before. When you were looking at bestseller lists, things like Orwell and It Can't Happen Here, Sinclair Lewis's book about American fascism, suddenly all these things were right back in the agenda. And I've always been a great admirer of Orwell, and the reason we did Animal Farm, to be honest, it's another kind of venal reason, because the obvious one, from a Scots point of view, I would say, is probably 1984. And Gavin and I had a wee chat about this to begin with, because 1984 is directly about language. Animal Farm is about language, we'll talk about that, but 1984 is certainly what everybody thinks is being the canonical book about the erosion of language. And what happens to English in 1984 is kind of in a lot of ways what's happening to Scots. All the good words get taken out until there's no words left for anything, and there's no way of expressing yourself in this language. So 1984 seemed like the best bet on one hand. On the other hand though, it is a big book. And there's a lot of stuff there that will, I hope to one day do it, but there's a lot of stuff in 1984 that will need coinages, it will need neologisms, it will need like the Ministry of Love, the Ministry of Defence, and Newspeak. These are all things that would have to be translated into Scots. And I'm working on it bit by bit, but Animal Farm seemed much more accessible and doable to begin with. And as I was working on Animal Farm, and as I've been translating Animal Farm, I found that actually it's a lot more about language than I minded it being, and that in a lot of ways, everything that Orwell had to say about language in his non-fiction and in 1984 eventually, he kind of says in miniature in Animal Farm. So, to be honest with you, I wasn't sure if it was going to work to begin with. I thought, we'll do, like when you're painting a wall, we'll do a wee total bit and we'll see how that comes out, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work and we'll forget it. But as I was going along, I found that it was working. It was working for numerous reasons. It was working because it's set on a farm, and that's one of the few things that we have extant Scots words for. It's just an extant Scots vocabulary for, I should say, farming technology and the lives of farmers. It's politically relevant, obviously, and it happened to be about something that I really deeply care about, which is language. As Miodi, who write or reads, or especially eventually Scots, about language and how language dies and can be manipulated and can be ultimately abused. So that's where the whole Animal Farm came from. It's something that we've been working on, me and Luath, for quite a while, because obviously we had the pandemic smack dab in the middle of this, and for a while there weren't going to be any more books, there weren't going to be any more publishers. Scots, I thought, was something that was really going to suffer during the pandemic, and we talked a wee bit about this during the Remistain event a wee while ago, because Scots is something that is dependent on personal interaction in a lot of ways. It's something that's dependent on older folk. Older folk are like the closest thing we have to Scots dictionaries in a lot of ways, and they were the things that were threatened by the pandemic. Being in the same room as somebody and talking to them face to face, and older folk. So there was a long time where I thought, this isn't going to happen. If it does happen, there's going to be nothing left. It's going to be like, there'll be the Statue of Liberty submerged in the sand, and that's it. That's what's going to be left after the pandemic. Unfortunately, as you can see by you guys all being here and by us actually having a book to launch, that's what happened. We come back to the pandemic, and Scots is still alive and well, thanks to folk like yourself, Ashley, and thanks to so many of the folk here. And we have a book to validate that. So I'm going to read a wee bit for chapter 20. Dawn was early in March. Throughout the following 3 months there was a fair weeding of secret ongoings. Major's speech had given the mere immensity animals on the farm a new outlook on life. They didn't ken when the rebellion weirded it by Major would come to pass. They had no reason at all to jealous that it would be within their own lifetimes. But they saw clearly that it was their duty to read up for it. The work of teaching and organising the others fell natural to the pigs, who were wont by mace to be the cleverest of the animals. Standing at the trump amongst the pigs were twa young boars cried Snowball and Napoleon, where Mr. Jones was breeding up for sale. Napoleon was a muckle kind of raj-looking Berkshire boar, the only Berkshire on the farm, not much for blethering, but with a good knack for getting his own way. Snowball was a sick near Birkie than Napoleon, swipper in speech and glegger tay, but no thought to have the same usurious smedon. All the other male pigs on the farm were porkers. The most you'll ken among them was a pudgety wee pig, cried Squealer, with round shafts, skinkling in, nimble feet, and a screechy voice. I should say Squealer's my favourite character in He was Uncle Gavy, that's why. And when he was flighting over some pernickety pint, he'd wee happen from side to side and withering his tail. It was somehow awfully plausible. Folks said to Squealer that he could hear you think black was white. The three of them had worked up old Major's teachings into a hale muckle system of thought that they'd heed the name of animalism. 3 hours next a week, after Mr. Jones was awa' to bed, they held fly gatherings in the barn and set for it the principles of animalism to the others. To start with, they were met with a hale ween of gleichnis and easy-ozy attitudes. Some of the animals talked about their duty of loyalty to Mr. Jones, where they called their maester. Or Mackett's menseless remarks as, Mr. Jones feeds us. If it wasn't for him, we'd starve to death. Others speaks at questions as, well, it's as it to us what happens after we're dead? Or, is this rebellion's going to happen on the roads? What does it matter if we do anything about it or no? And the pigs had some time getting over to them that all of this was against the spirit of animalism. The most gowked questions all were speared by Molly, the white mare. Molly's my second favourite character. The very first question she speared to Snowball was, will there be sugar after the rebellion? No, said Snowball dourly. We haven't the makings of sugar in this farm. Only gates, you'll not need sugar. You'll hae all the aits and hay you could ever want. And will I still be allowed to busk my mane up with ribbons? Speared Molly. My fear, said Snowball. The only ribbons that you're ratting at me are the kenmerks of theraldom. Do you no understand how freedom is worth mair as ribbons? Molly tell me she did, but she didn't seem awfully convinced. The pigs had Ian Mayer, the sair feck dinging down the havers pit about by Moses, the tame corby. Moses, who was Mr. Jones' dotty wee pet, was a clatterbag and a clyde, but for Barrydon he could gift to the gab. He made out to ken all about this unco country cried Sugar Rolly Ben, where all the animals went once they were dead. It was set somewhere up in the sky, a wee bitty, ayont the clouds, Moses said. In Sugar Rolly Ben, it was Sunday 7 days a week. Clover was in season all year round, and sugar lumps and linseed cake grew on the hedges. The animals couldn't stick Moses, cause he was a click a clashing, did hee-haw work, but a weenie of them believed in Sugar Rolly Ben, and the pigs had to sleep off the herd to persuade them that there was no sick place.
Thank you so much for that reading, Tamis, and I think as we can just see for that, Tamis says it's more than just a translation, it's a transformation into Scots. It takes on a whole other feel, and I guess in translation terms we're talking there about, it's an idiomatic translation. It's far from a literal translation where you've just switched a few words into like a wee bit more Scots. And I suppose when you're translating from English to Scots, a bad translation would be just tweaking the odd word into Scots, or maybe changing the ovs to o's, but you can still have a pretty good guess at what the underlying English sentence would be, and it's just kind of Scoticised English. That's not what Tamis is doing here. It's a full-on sense translation. It's an idiomatic translation. It brings it to life in a whole other way in Scots, and I'm that glad Tamis chose to read it that bit, because one of my favourite sentences in the whole book when I was reading was this one. Napoleon was a muckle, kindy raj-looking Berkshire boar. Now, in the English, that's Napoleon was a large, rather fierce-looking Berkshire boar. It's just a completely different feel. And another example, just for the bit that Tamis read out there, is in Scots, it's got the pigs had a sair fecht, dinging down the havers put about by Moses, the tame corby. There's just so much in there, like every single word is so Scots, and in a way that there's not an immediate English translation. I think that's a mark of a brilliant translation, which every single sentence in this book is. Honestly, I'm not just, he is one of my best pals as well. I'm not just saying that because he's one of my best pals, but it really is. And if you're like the pigs had a sair fecht, straight away there's multiple ways you could translate that into English. In this case, Orwell's words are the pigs had a hard struggle, but it could be a number of other things. It's not immediately obvious if you were just reading the Scots, and same ding and dun the havers to counteract the lies. So Tanis, I genuinely wanted to ask you this question because I didn't ken myself, but how do you go about achieving such a natural idiomatic translation? Do you do a sort of like literal draft in the first instance just to get it into Scots, and then do you go back and like idiomaticize it a bit more, or what's your work and how do you do this?
Well, it's funny you should ask me that, because I've got a wee story to tell, but this has been something, Animal Fairm has been something that's been kind of in the offing for a long time because of the pandemic and whatnot. So there'll be loads of periods where I was working on it quite intensively, and then there'll be periods where I wasn't working on it at all and forgot all about it. And it got to a stage where I was more or less happy with it and I thought it was finished. And then there was a few months, and then Gavin must have got in touch and said, right, that's us, we're ready to get on this, you got it, can you send us your final version? So I was like, okay, I'm quite happy with it, it's going to be good. So I opened it up on Word. You're laughing because you ken what I'm talking about. I opened it up in Word, and this is Sarah, my wife, by the way, and I wasn't just saying one word for names. I opened it up on Word, and it was terrible. It was I've never been so embarrassed and heart-stricken in my entire life. For 50 minutes, I was like, this is unpublishable. I'm going to have to go to Gavin and say, no, I thought it was good, but it's not. It's absolutely bad. And I think this is probably a common mistake for writers to make. I think it's the first time I've done it, but I'm sure something that happens a lot. I'd opened an earlier draft there. So that's what's happened. But it was dreadful. And the reason I'm saying that is because when I translate, I do what you're saying, which is to go through the whole thing once quickly. And there's loads of reasons to do that. One is so you feel like you're making some kind of progress. Otherwise you can be stuck on the one image for weeks on end or hours on end. The other reason is about particularly Animal Fairm. You've got threads that are going to run through the whole book, and there's going to be things that you need to decide right for the get-go, more or less, how you're going to translate them. So you need to really ken how you're going to translate the Ten Commandments, the Animal Fairm. You need to ken how you're going to translate two legs good, four legs bad. You need to ken four legs bad, two legs good. No, two legs bad. One of the ones that I wasn't sure about how I was going to translate, and that's why I do this, because you find out as you go along what there is that's there, other than the obvious things. And one of the obvious ones, there should be obvious, but wasn't to me, was comrades, because comrades comes up a lot in Animal Fairm. So you could just leave that as comrades, I suppose. Translate it as I was just thinking brothers, my fears, my fears is what I went for in the end. But it's going to matter how you've got to translate it consistently. And it's going to matter all the way through, because if you're committed to my fears, and for some reason it works in one paragraph and no in another, for some reason it's too close to something, it might just even be a sound thing, it might just be it's too close to other F words or something like that, it's going to sound clumsy. So that's why I do it all the way through in Luath. But when I'm doing that, if I'm not totally sure about something, particularly with Animal Fairm, I would just leave it basically in the original English, because I didn't want to half translate it and do a wee Chinese whispers thing where I was half translating and gone back to the half translation and half translating that. You know, if you're doing Orwell, you've got to translate Orwell, you've got to translate exactly what Orwell was getting at. So this first draft was 40-50% more or less English, or what you were describing where you've translated the words but no the sense. So you've just translated it word for word, but it's still in English grammar, and it sounds like the underlying English, and like you were saying, you could easily translate it back into English and know exactly what it was that had originally been said. So that's the way I do it, you know, that's the way I've always done it, and it's the way it works for me. I'm not recommending it to anybody else, especially seeing as you open up the wrong draft a couple of weeks before a publication day. You get your email opened for you, but that's what I've always done. What do you do? Just out of curiosity, Ash.
I mean, the same, like
okay.
a first draft into Scots, but highlighting bits that you're like, there is going to be a better Scots for this, like there will be an idiomatic. Sometimes the words come right to you, but sometimes you're like, there will be a better way to do this. It's not coming to me just now, you just need to think. And I think, because language is, it's an art, not a science, and on a given situation there will be various acceptable ways to translate something into Scots, so it's just about deciding on a case by case basis what's the best way for this context. So there's words that you'll highlight where you're like, this needs to be taken out of English and put into Scots in that very idiomatic way. But those are the ones that take you a while. And we've had that with projects that we've worked on together as well. There's bits that you're like, we'll come back to that. Or you've got like 3 or 4 options and you just work your way through it. So much the same.
There's a lot of that in Animal Fairm, because obviously Orwell is such a quintessentially English writer, stylistically and subject matter in every way. So there's lots of things in Animal Fairm that trip you up and tempt you to translate word for word, and are going to sound absolutely drip as per that first draft. So there's tons of stuff like that you're talking about, like the body farce, the kind of thing that we think we don't have the words for it in Scots, but we do. We just need to think outside the box a wee bit.
That's it. Yeah. And so in some ways, I'm not saying it was easy to translate this book, because it's never easy, but in a Scots context, as we'll kid, sometimes when we work in minoritised languages, such as Scots or Gaelic or Welsh, so languages that are minoritised today and therefore often haven't like organically developed vocab in certain spheres, like technical spheres or scientific spheres. So a project that Thomas and I worked on before, for example, was translating an internet browser into Scots. Now that wasn't a straightforward case of just putting the words from English into Scots, because the words didn't exist in Scots yet. So our first task there was literally creating the Scots internet vocab. That was a big project. There was many options going about for that. But in this case, as you touched upon in your initial remarks as well, when it comes to the Fairm and animals, you're not actually short on Scots vocab. You've got cuddies and coos and doos and all sorts. So do you want to just reflect on how translating this book, its Fairmuir context, differs for working in Scots generally? To what extent did you have to coin any new words that didn't already exist for this book?
I don't think I did have to coin any new words at
Not
all.
a single one?
I can't think any, because there's no terminology like there would be in 1984. There's no newspeak, there's no double thing, there's no nothing like that. The only thing was that because it's set in England, and it could be set anywhere, because it is set in England, the place names are very English. So some of the names of the other farms, for instance, are very English. There's references to like publications and newspapers that are quintessentially English, and they tempt you to think, well, I've got to set this in Scotland as well as translate it into Scots. And I struggled back and forth with that bit for a while. The farm stuff is brilliant. The 1940s when Animal Fairm was being written are, I imagine, are probably not quite the heyday of Scots, but certainly Scots would still have been, it still is, obviously still is. The Scots would have been very much the lingua franca, the rural places where firms were still based. So that bit was brilliant. The hard bit was being tempted to try and set it in Scotland, especially when, like I think I mentioned in the introduction, it's a fable. It could be set anywhere. The fact that it's set in England, obviously it's not really set in England. It's about the Soviet Union, but it could be about anywhere. It could be about anything. In the end, I didn't go for setting it in Scotland just because it felt like it would be inauthentic. It felt like, one of my favourite films, I'm not going to be objective. Amadeus is one of the best films ever made. Now, Mozart didn't speak English, but like it's fine for him to speak English in a film. But for this, I felt like it would just be gratuitous to set it in Scotland. I didn't feel like that was necessary. I felt like it would be, gimmicky is the main thing. And when you're working in Scots, you're always kind of aware that what you're doing is going to be seen as gimmicky anyway. No matter what you do or how you do it, somebody's going to say, there's no point in that, it's a waste of time, you're just aiming to get attention. So I didn't set it in Scotland in the end, and that was the hardest bit, finding ways, a few of the English place names I would translate in Scots if they had obvious equivalents, so like you could Foxwood, which translated to Toddwood, but for the most part I just had to accept that we're going to come across these English place names that were going to hit you in the eye and jar you a wee bit. Everything else about it in terms of Scots though, and that was the other thing, because obviously as you get in a lot of the translation I do is kids books, books for younger people, and you're very limited in the vocabulary you can use when you're working with younger people or writing for younger people. And I felt like I could be a wee bit freer with the Scots that I used here. Yeah. There's words that, there's just words that are gorgeous that you'd never use the word lattergot when you were writing for Bairns, because the kids couldn't have heard that and I'm not going to know that it means rainbow. But it's such a great word. could use words like that in Animal Fairm, and it was so liberating to be able to do it. I can't tell you off the top of my head what words that I used that I've been storing away and waiting to use, but it was just really nice to be able to finally write the kind of Scots that you wish you were able to write and read and speak all the time.
So I've got 4 wee points to mark on that. One, it is just a very fun fact that Twy, Thomas's most famous books, now feature pig protagonists, because his most famous Bairns book is Peppa Pig. This is the world famous author of Peppa Pig in Scots, which I'm not sure if he's chuffed to know that that's what he's most kind of. So yeah, up till now, but yeah, he is, if you want books translated into Scots featuring pig protagonists, he is your man.
I'm up for Charlotte's Web next to him.
And yeah, what you were saying about including, I've written here in my notes about your translation, skillfully includes more advanced Scots vocabulary, which is, you know, which it does. So because as I touched upon there, because Scots is a minoritised language today, most Scots speakers aren't literate in it, and a lot of our vocab and our best words have actually fallen out of use. So it's quite a troco as a translator sometimes to ken that there's a brilliant Scots word for something, but to have to decide that it's the right word for the context. And a lot of the work again that Thomas and I have done together is for like the general public, the general Scots speaker who maybe probably isn't literate in Scots, certainly isn't reading high literature in Scots. And if we chuck in words that are brilliant Scots words that can be attested to in dictionary of the Scots language, but that the average Scots speaker is just going to go, I have no idea what that means, and then you just lose them and alienate them, we can't use it. So I completely, and I love reading your book for that on that basis, because I just knew that you'd be having the time of your life putting all these words, and some of the words that I wrote down for that was like mensfu, etal, flighten, repone, threep, thoroldom, fleminute, harnpan. These are all words that wouldn't get anywhere near accessible in Scots. And I think that's when we're translating in Scots, you almost have like, it's not just like translating, I also do translation in like German and Danish, and it's pretty straightforward. You just translate into German or Danish or out of those languages into English. You don't need to worry about what type of English. With Scots, I feel like we have to work either into accessible Scots or into like advanced Scots, and what we've got here is advanced Scots for sure. And I did put, yeah, you did it so skillfully, but even then, still with the eye to accessibility, because all the words you use, the more advanced ones, they're still in such a clear way that I guess, I mean, I even learned words from it. I'm also like a Scottish writer and translator, and I was learning new words. Had to go up and happily look them up in DSL, and I'll add that to my like treasured list of vocab as well. But yeah, we've come onto this topic nicely. So in your hour setters note or translators note, it's one of the words in itself to hour set to translate. And there, you set out your commitment at the beginning to take down the narrow, straight accessibility. And later, you reflect that ilka Scots queer or every Scots book has to, and that's your emphasis, has to assume the responsibility of teaching its readers how to read it. So I've covered a wee bit of that there, but do you want to just reflect on your approach to accessibility, dealing with the fact that many Scots speakers who are going to pick this up might be the first time they've tried to read in Scots, and
No, it's a really interesting question. I suppose my experience mainly, or mostly, in translation has been working with kids' books up until now. And like I say, you're trammelled with the vocabulary you can use. But on the other hand, there's something like Peppa Pig and Diary of a Wimpy Kid, which is another illustrated book that I've translated. You can count on the fact that the bairn in question who's reading it can see a picture of the thing that you're talking about. So in Diary of a Wimpy Kid, there's a bit where he's talking about Noah's Ark, and that's the main character, Greg. And he talks about hedgehogs. Now, the Scots word for hedgehog is hurchin. I don't think most bairns would ken that, but because there's a wee handy drawing underneath of a hedgehog, you think, well, I can risk that, that's fine, I'll do that and it'll be alright. So most of the time, what you're trying to do is, with Scots, whether it's for parents or for adults, is to try and work within, make sure that you create a context that any words that you do use that are everyday, or that have maybe adapted to usage, or if they're accumulated a wee bit of store, that any words you do use have got a context around them that's going to make sure that whoever's reading it can understand it. And with kids, there's no better training for that than working with and writing for kids. Writing for kids has been the thing that's really set me up to the Animal Fairm, and make sure that every time I use a Scots word, it's a wee bit out the way. And I'm very hand Glasgow, and Glasgow dialect isn't prized, I would say. It's maybe dominant in a lot of ways in our media, but it's one of the weaker dialects in terms of how much Scots retention or how much pure Scots vocabulary retention there is there. So I'm somebody that inherently kens a lot of Scots words that I've trapped to usage. I've learned in the same way everybody else, which is by reading what other folks writing, and then gone to the DSL and looking them up, and then thought, well, why did this trap it usage? What's wrong with this word? This word's better than the English. This idiom's better than the English. What's going on? Why do we not use this more? Why do we need Hurchin? What's wrong with that? Why do we need hedgehog? We don't need hedgehog, we've got Hurchin. We don't need horse, we've got cuddy. So I guess what I'm saying is that you're always working, and this is the thing about Scots, that you're not working on and it's something you kind of mentioned before, you're not working on a word by word basis, you're working on a sentence by sentence basis in all the ways. You're trying to make sure that the sentences cohere together. You can never translate in isolation, which is one of the reasons why I translate all the way through, to find out the bits where it's going to be hard to translate a certain word or a certain idea because the context in the original work doesn't make it clear what it is. The context assumes you're going to know what the original word is, but it's sometimes got to use the Scots word. Got to. You can't, if you know, like rainbow being a good example, if you ken that there's a Scots word for rainbow and it's watergaw, go use it even if it's really hard within that context to make it clear what a watergaw is. Even if it's snow, even if folk are going to have to go away and look it up in DSL. But in general, you've got to teach people about reading the book, how to read it. And I think that's true of a lot of writers, but it's especially true of Scots writers. Right, to say nobody, or almost nobody, is actually literate in Scots, in the sense that we're literate in English. We're only taught Scots at school most days. And today's bairns are taught a wee bit more lucky then, but anybody in this room is probably unlikely to have been taught Scots in a formal, structured way. So we're all struggling with it, and we're all learning it, and we all mind, even those who are quite literate, mind within the no too distant past what it was like to know ken Scots and to struggle with Scots and to have to navigate every single word individually. And I don't think it should be that hard to put yourself back in that mindset. And I don't think it does any service to translate Scots in today what the Puritans were doing, to have a Scots that is in every way matches up to King James's Scots 400 or 500 years ago, but is unreadable now. It's just nobody any good. Where the whole point of this book, well, not the whole point, but one of the big points in the book is to encourage folk to learn to read in Scots. And if this book puts an half learning to read in Scots, then it's a failure. It's a total failure no matter what else it succeeds in.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with Thomas Mayer, you'll be surprised to hear. But and you've absolutely achieved it in this book. It's both readable and accessible. I think any average speaker of Scots will be able to follow it, no bother, but you're also helping them to expand their vocab at the same time, so become literate in the Scots they already ken, and also expand their vocab. With a vocab that, like you said, growing up on the West Coast wasn't part of your, I wasn't saying words like freak and flighting when I was growing up in Edinburgh myself. Part of my Scots vocab new, but that's Scots that I've taught myself as an adult, as I've become literate in it, so you're giving that to any reader that picks that up. They'll understand the most part of it for their Scots that they already speak, and they'll get more gems along the way.
Well, that's where we go through for. That's where we go flighting for. I didn't ken exactly where, but there'll be a poem or a play or a story or something that we'll have read it in, and that's what's keeping these words alive. These books are word kists, like you were saying before.
Yeah.
And
they're brilliant words, and I mean they're so steeped in Scottish history. Like the flightings and the Mackers, that's like right back to Scots history in the Middle Ages, like the high point of Scots literature. And these words like threepin, and I think it's also about register. Because obviously, because Scots is minoritised today, people often associate it with like lower register colloquial settings in this book. And I suppose Bairns books know that they're lower register per se, but it's Bairns books, it's immediately in a different sphere. Yeah. This is serious political literature, classical English literature. So again, it's a setting where folk aren't as used to seeing Scots, and you again hit the very just spot on registered vocab, and it's a vocab of Scots that folk are not as used to seeing. So as you touch upon in your introduction, by the way, I love the fact that the introduction to the book and the translator's note or Eversetter's note are also in Scots, which in itself is like prose Scots is again something we're not as used to seeing. We're maybe used to seeing poetry in Scots, or quite colloquial, like even tweets or WhatsApp messages in Scots, or variance books in Scots. But again, even before you even get to the our setting proper, you've got a translator's note and an introduction to the book in Scots. Also magnificent.
Just to interrupt you, I've got to give credit to the folks at Luath for a lot of that, because whenever there was something that was going to be in English, like a blurb or a press release or something, diffident about saying, can you have it in Scots as well? Because you're giving other people work that they don't need, and you're giving other people work that a lot of the time is just symbolic. But Luath have been great across the board about making sure that everything's available, any material, any resources, anything around the book is available in Scots as well as in English, or in Scots instead of English.
Brilliant. And it's awfully important to normalise Scots in that way and see it in other places. But as you write in Scots in your introduction, Orwell had, we could say, mixed views on Scots and on Scotland. What do you reckon he would have made of this Animal Fairm in Scots?
Well, he did have mixed views about Scotland. I think he's progressed his views as time went on. But to begin with, well, I don't ken how much everybody kens about Orwell, but he had his prejudices like any man in his time, and he certainly seemed to hate Scotland with a passion at certain points in his life. Apparently, the impetus for that was that he went to a boarding school in England where, and it's hard for us to imagine this now, even though it's not that long ago, he went to a boarding school in England where all the other folk, he was himself, I think he described himself as upper middle lower class. You know, he didn't see himself as being a gentleman or an aristocrat. But the other folk at the school who were of breeding or privilege tended to have, this particular school tended to have Scottish heritage, and they tended to have estates in Scotland where they'd spent many a happy hour as a young lad, blah, 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 blah. So there was a real Scots culture, a kind of snooty Scots culture at this particular school. And that was the start of George Orwell not thinking very much of Scots, which seems utterly bizarre to us, the idea that you would dislike Scots because Scots are, I don't know, up here and you're down here. That is not something that Vine chimes with as new, but that was the start. Then Orwell went to work in Burma. He went to Burma to be an imperial policeman, and obviously one of the things that we're keen to promote in all the lives here nowadays is the idea of Scotland as a junior partner in the Empire, and Orwell certainly didn't see Scotland as a junior partner in the Empire. When he was in Burma, he worked with many Scots who were part of the imperial project, and he didn't think very much of them at all. He thought they were drunkards, he thought they were unpleasant people generally, as I imagine a lot of people probably who were working for the Empire, what the British Empire were. And so that put off Scottish people more or less for life. Apparently, he crossed the road deliberately to avoid having to speak to Edwin Muir, to be introduced to avoid being introduced to Edwin Muir, the Scottish writer. In his wee list at the end of his life, he wrote a wee list that people exaggerate, make it sound like it was a kind of McCarthy-esque thing. It wasn't quite, but he wrote a list of people who basically he thought shouldn't be in positions of power in the media, people who basically couldn't be trusted to look after the best interests of the country. And Hugh McDermott was one of the people who put there, and he hated Hugh McDermott, but then so did everybody, so it doesn't mean much. But I do think at a time he did change his mind about Scotland. I do think, obviously he spent what he must have kept, probably going to be the last years of his life here in Jura. If you've ever been to Hairmyres Hospital, aka if you've ever played football in Glasgow, then you'll see there's a plaque in Hairmyres Hospital proclaiming it as the place where George Orwell wrote 1984. And that seems weird now, but then you imagine what it must have been like when he was there, and you think about Room 101 and you think, yeah, probably you can see why a hospital would be a logical place to start you thinking about 1984. And I think he changed his mind about Scotland, I think. And this is mere my speculation, this wee bit. But I think why Orwell's wee things was that he had a kind of queasy, he had a sort of ambiguous attitude to the idea of martyrdom or victimhood. And so in his books, whether it's the Burmese or the prose in 1984 or the animals in Animal Fairm, there's a mixture of empathy and almost contempt. He's never quite able to make his mind up whether he feels sorry for the oppressed or whether he thinks the oppressed need to get up off their backsides and do something about it. And I think that's where he said, and I think Scots, like there's towards the end of his life, he was writing things that were sympathetic about Scottish culture, that were sympathetic about the idea of Scotland being less than it could be, but that weren't wholly rah 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 hooray for Scotland. And one of the things that I mentioned one of the final things I'll say is that I mentioned a wee bit in the intro is that Orwell had hundreds of books, as you'd expect. He had thousands of books passed through his hands. He wrote reviews for newspapers and whatnot, so he had loads of books. He didn't make a habit of hanging on to them. Once he'd done with a book, that was it. He chucked it, he gave it away, he didn't hang on to it. So the few books that he did have, it tended to indicate that they really meant something to him. One way or another, he was getting something out of them. And one of the few books that he had left in his collection when he died was a Gaelic dictionary that he picked up on the Isle of Jura. And I think, it's my personal opinion, that Orwell is interested in language in his own way as we are, the Scots. And he was obsessed in a lot of ways with the devaluation of English, and he was always talking about he hated cliches, he hated political cliches in particular. And I think that in some ways Orwell might have been working his way towards looking for a kind of escape hatch for English. And I think for a lot of his writing in Scots, that's what Scots is. It's a way of getting away for the cliches, the fact that English has become the language of commerce and capitalism in a lot of ways. I think that Orwell maybe, I don't know if he'd have learnt Gaelic. I don't think he'd have gone that far. But so obviously he was interested in the idea of this language that was still relatively untouched by the things that he thought had corrupted English. And I think so. He hadn't got there with Scots yet. I don't think he doesn't have much nice to say about Scots as a language. He certainly doesn't describe it as a language, he just sticks to describing it as a dialect. But I think he would have got there with Scots. And certainly, that's the other thing. He thought translation hard. He famously, one of the few things he did with Animal Fairm was that he wrote an introduction for the Ukrainian version, because the Ukrainians were exactly the people then, and maybe new, who should have been reading Animal Fairm. So he wrote an introduction, which is something he very rarely did for anything. He gave away the translation rights to Animal Fairm right, left and centre. He made almost no money out of it being translated because he wanted it to be read by the people who he thought needed to read it. So I think Orwell, I hope he's not burling in his grave. I think he would be alright with it. I think he'd be alright.
I think you're right, yeah, presenting it as a sort of escape for English and bringing his story to life. No in English, which we've all become a bit used to, and it's lost a bit of its punch, but in this Scots instead.
I think so. And if he was giving the book away when he was still alive, he wouldn't be bothered with the fact that it's a copyright, he wasn't going to get any royalties. I'm sure he would do that as well.
Now, just do a quick check on where we are for time.
It's quarter to.
Quarter to.
Yeah, quarter to.
Cool. Well, I'm going to ask Thomas one final question, and that's a wee heads up for you to think of any questions you might have for him as well. So, Thomas, if you could translate any book you wanted into Scots, what yin would it be? Give it all the time in the world, no day job.
But if you wanted to take that one, actually, the Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino, which is my favourite book anyway, and I've translated one or two. That is, if you don't know what it's about, it's the conceit of it is it's Marco Polo. He's been travelling around the world, and he goes back to Kubla Khan with descriptions of these fantastical cities that he's visited while he's been away, and each fantastical city only takes up a page or two. The whole book is like maybe 100 pages. So you may probably ask him why I haven't done it already. It's because Italo Calvino didn't die that long ago, so his books are still in copyright. I have translated a couple of them into Scots, and I think they work really well. I've written my own versions. There are things that are, my attempt at the same thing. They don't work quite so well because I'm a little Calvino, but that's right for translation. And if I ever find out basically who's in charge of Italo Calvino's estate now, then that is the one that I would do, and that's the one I thought would really work.
Brilliant. Well, I look forward to that one. Thomas, you're just going to give us, please, another short reading, and then we'll do Q&A.
Alrighty. Aye. Okay. So, I said already that my favourite characters are Squealer and Molly, so I'm kind of struggling to decide which one of the three I'm going to read a bit about for But I think I'll go for Squealer. So this is after This is after Snowball's been flighted out the firm and he's been blamed. Spoiler alert, I'm assuming everybody's read or has a vague idea what it's about. But anyway, this is after X has been flighted out the firm and he's been blamed for everything that goes wrong in the firm. And Squealer has become the voice, the mouthpiece, I suppose we'd say, of the regime, and is constantly going around explaining to everybody, whilst everything looks terrible, it's not as bad as you'd think. And I think that's one of the reasons I wouldn't say I like Squealer, but he certainly feels like a modern character. I think we've got a lot of people like Squealer that go around explaining to everybody why, well, this looks terrible, but it's actually not as bad as all that. And here's why. So, the animals were awfully feared. Today it may seem as if Snowball was some kind of Scotch mist, infusing the air all around and shoring them with dangers that ill portend. In the evening, Squealer caught them all together, and with a worried expression on his face told them that he'd some grave news to give you. "My fears!" cried Squealer, making flisky wee links. "And awfully thing has just came out. Snowball has sold himself to Frederick of Scrimpfield Firm, where even now is scheming to attack us and take our firm away from us. Snowball's going to act as his guide once the attack begins, but that's not even the worst of it. We'd all thought that Snowball's rebellion was caused by his geared-gone arrogance just, but we were wrong, my fears. Do you ken what the real reason was? Snowball was in with Jones right frae the off. The whole time he was working for Jones on the fly. We've only just aired out the documents that he left to him and that proved the whole thing by. If you ask me, this all explains an awful lot, my fears. Did you still see for yourselves how he ettled, to no avail, small mercies, to hear us all gubbed and Malafuster at the Battle of the Cool Shed? The animals couldn't credit their mighty lugs. This was badness for a young Snowball's dinging down the windmill. But it was a few minutes before they could tack it all in. They all minded, or thought they minded, how they'd seen Snowball charging ahead of them at the Battle of the Cool Shed, how he'd rallied and hurted them at Elka Turn, and how he hadn't swithered for an instant. No, even when the pellets for Jones's gun had scared him along his back. At first it wasn't easy to see how this all chimed with him being on Jones's side. Even Boxer, who hardly ever speared with anything, was struggling with it. He lay down his four hoofs beneath him, shut his in, and with a muckle machiny mocht managed to compose his thoughts. I can't get my head round on, he said. Snowball thought we sped him at the Battle of the Cool Shed. I saw him myself. Did we not give him Animal Hero first class right after them? It was his George we should have given him, I fear, because we all ken now, it's all there in black and white in non-documents I was saying about, that the whole time he was etling to wile us to your doom. But it was hard to say, said Boxer, rusting his back, running with blood. That was all part of his plan, Cranswheeler. Jones shot only skipped him. I could show you on his own screeving if you were fit to read it. Their ploy was for Snowball at the right minute to give the signal to bolt and lay the field to the enemy. And he just about managed it too. But, my fears, I'll tell you this, he would have managed it if it hadn't been for our heroic headsman, Brother Napoleon. Do you not mind? Do you not mind how, just at the very second Jones and his men had got into the yard, Snowball had suddenly turned and ta'en flicked, and a ween the animals had followed him. And do you not mind, forby, that it was just at that moment, when nobody had lost the heat, and the ball was just about on the slates, that Brother Napoleon leapt for it, with a cry of "Death to humanity!" and sank his teeth into Jones's shank. Surely his mind all that, my fears, cried Squealer, hopping from one side to the other. Now that Squealer had set it all out for him like Lonid, it seemed to the animals they did mind it after all. But I guess they minded that at the creased in effect, Snowball had turned and done a runner. But Boxer was still no sicker. I can't credit that Snowball was a traitor right through the start, he said. Well, he's done staying there, that's different. But for myself, I still think that at the Battle of the Cool Shed, he was a good fear to us. Our headsman, Brother Napoleon, and then Squealer, speaking awfully firmly and slowly, had said Plain as parridge. Plain as parridge, my fear, that Snobber, who's Jonesy's crony, left from the very beginning. Aye, every lang afore the rebellion was even thought of. Aye, well, that's another thing altogether then, said Boxer. If Brother Napoleon says it, it might be right. You're no wrong there, my fear. You're no wrong at all, cried Squealer, though you couldn't help noticing that he shot Boxer a wrecked dirty look with his skinkling wee.